Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome, everyone, to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility on this extremely cold Tuesday, the 7th of January, 2014. This is, I've told a couple of people this morning, because naturally everybody's talking about the weather, and I kind of suggested it was so cold last night. I actually told a couple of people I almost feel blessed to be here to see this, because it's incredible. It was -8 here in Beckley this morning when I got up at about 7 a.m. I guess, and the previous low in Beckley was 4 degrees, 4 below, according to the weatherman this morning. And the newspaper reported today that the coldest recorded temperature in West Virginia was in 1917, December 30th, 1917. It was 37 below. That was in Lewisburg, which is about an hour east of where I sit right now in Beckley. And we're quite a bit higher in the mountains than Lewisburg. So my guess is if Lewisburg recorded 37 below in 1917 on that day, then I'm guessing that this area was probably colder. More than likely was, but I don't know that. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you today. I hope you're keeping warm. I am sitting in a studio here with it was once an open porch, and consequently there's no insulation overhead, so it's very difficult to keep this place warm or to cool it off in the summertime, very honestly, because there's a porch above it, and I've had a heater in here for a couple of hours, and I've been able to raise the temperature from 53 to 60, so I'm sitting here with gloves on, but that's okay. I tend to be a little bit cold-blooded as I get older anyway, as my blood thins and the rest of it. But I guess you don't want to hear about that at all, do we? Anyway, it's a pleasure to be with you today, and let me give you the specifics. And I wanted to spend a few minutes on a wonderful call that we had at the end of the program yesterday from Darlene and in Connecticut. I wanted to kind of touch on a few of the things that she mentioned, and then kind of go back into our conversation about the so-called retirement crisis. This is Elizabeth Warren's term in her speech in the United States Senate on the 18th of November of this past year, 2013. Also, during the holidays, I read a blog written by Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont. This was dated I think the 30th of December. That's ironic. It's the same date we were just talking about in 1917 when the temperature was 37 below. And he basically touched on many of the same issues. And I thought I would make reference to a couple of comments he made as well. So anyway, I look forward to today. I think this particular subject is extremely important. As we become even an older nation than we are now, and we have more and more people who are into or rapidly approaching retirement, and I think these kinds of issues are very, very significant. And again, we'll go back and revisit them. But I do invite you to call, and I don't know. Hopefully, Darlene may touch base with us again, but if she doesn't, I'm sure she will later. It was a delightful call, and I thank her for it. And I encourage you to make your thoughts known, your concerns or your issues or considerations that you've had on the topic of the day or topics related to what we're talking about. The phone number is area code 304, and the number is 658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. 888-888-3333. My personal email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me, by all means, I would love to hear from you. waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Yesterday we were talking about the market, about the performance in the last 12 months of the Dow and the stock market, and the fact that I was referencing an article that appeared on Sunday in our local paper here about the magic year on the market. The title of the article was An Epic Market. And the Dow increased over the course of the 12 months of 2013. The Dow increased 27%. Excuse me. And we saw, as the article mentioned, we saw the Dow average pass 14,000 in February, 15,000 in May, 16,000 in November, and I noticed today, about an hour ago, I was looking, the Dow is up over 100 points today, and that is now raises the Dow to over 16,500. And the predictions in this article, the predictions of some of the experts are that in 2014 the market will probably end the year somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,900 for the Dow. So that's incredible. I can remember a number of years ago when the Dow was 600, 500, 600, 700 in that area. And part of the reason for this incredible increase in the numbers is related to retirement, matters connected to retirement. The influx of all of this retirement money into the market in the late 80s and continuing into the 90s fueled the market, fueled the Dow to a point that it drove the averages up substantially. And so now we're talking 1,300, 1,400, 13, 14, 15,000, when in fact we were talking. In fact, on Sunday, I have the copy of the Sunday paper here. The Dow on Sunday was 16,469, and it's now it's up over 16,500 today with a 100 plus point increase. It was up over 100 points. It was up a little bit more than that earlier today, but I think it's kind of settled down now to about 101 or 104 or something like that. And so, obviously, the so-called correction that a lot of the experts are expecting hadn't happened yet. It's far longer than the usual. The usual average, according to this article, the usual average for a 10% correction is usually about every 18 months or so. And as of now, we've gone to more than 27 months without a correction. A lot of people are expecting that. And what that means is that the Dow will probably decline about 10% as part of the correction. And so that's what we were talking about yesterday. We were talking about the performance of the Dow, but most important to me is the issue of who's benefiting from this, and of course the other side of that coin is who is not. And the inference in the article, and kind of what prompted the idea for such a program, is the assumption that seems to undergird this entire article, that because of the performance of the Dow last year in 2013, many of the people that were hurt by the Great Recession in 07 and 08 were able to recoup their losses. And the fact that, and this is kind of a pervasive assumption throughout the article. And the fact of the matter is, of course, one point that I made yesterday, tried to make yesterday, was that in fact many of the experts will point out that you never really recoup your losses, so to speak, because you'll always be behind even if you catch up to where you were when the recession hit in 07, 08, the fact of the matter is if there hadn't been that Great Recession, you'd be that much further ahead now. So in a sense, while the market recovers, those that are hurt by it, affected negatively by it, never fully recover, and what they would have had if there had not been the recession. That's one factor. But the most important factor, and I think what we spent quite a bit of time on yesterday, was the fact that that I have serious questions about whether, in fact, the people that were hurt the most in 07 and 08 by the Great Recession are the same people that benefited from the 27% increase in the Dow over the last 12 months. In fact, I would suggest to you that all the evidence indicates that it's probably a totally different group of people. That the fact of the matter is that many of the people that were most hurt in 07 and 08 in the so-called Great Recession were new investors, so to speak, that were people that were uninformed, rather uninformed, and not all that knowledgeable about the market, about the behavior, and they were burned as a result. Chances are that many of those who were the most accomplished investors, the ones that were most knowledgeable about the market, probably were able to escape some of the worst effects of the downturn. That's a generalization, but I think it's probably true. But the fact of the matter is that many of the people who were hurt the most in 07 and 08, because they were new people and not accomplished investors, are probably no longer in the market. Many of them swore off the market. In fact, that's one of the comments that Darlene made in her call yesterday, is that she's afraid of the market, and I think with reason. And I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong with this or with investing or anything else, but the fact of the matter is, it is gambling. There's absolutely no question. I mean, you are basically putting your money into the market with the basic idea is that you're going to basically be able to realize a profit from it. That's the name of the game. And of course, the more shrewd you are as an investor, the better chance that you have to secure ups and to avoid downs, as they say. And I don't know if they say it, but that's what I say. And so consequently, it would seem to me that the people that were most vulnerable are likely not still there if they were hurt that badly by the market. And again, I realize that this is a generalization because I realize that many people who are accomplished investors were hurt. I mean, one of the things you pick up as you read about some of the events associated with the Great Recession, with the downturn, and the crisis in the market, many of them were accomplished investors and were burned. And of course, if you read about the Madoff scandal and some of these other so-called less than up and honest investors, and of course we know about the Ponzi scheme that Madoff, and he caught some really big people in it. The owners of the New York Mets, I believe, was hurt by it. Many prominent investors were hurt by it, and he was able to sucker a lot of accomplished investors. So it's not totally accurate to say that the only people that got hurt were the naive and the new investors and the new people playing on the market. But I would generally say that that's probably true. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, as we look now at the tremendous increase in the Dow over the last year, it's pretty obvious that many of these people are the shrewdest players, the so-called day traders that spend their day sitting at a computer and buy and sell thousands of shares of stock on a given day or over a given weekend or whatever. And You know, they're making such huge transactions that they can literally affect the performance of the market itself. And you know, these are the people. One of the things that all the numbers, as we read about and hear more and more about the growing inequality gap in America, and the fact, and the president himself has made this comment, that most of the benefits derived from the recovery from the Great Recession over the last couple of years have gone to the 1%, or even to the 1/10 of 1%, the very, you know, the most wealth, the wealthiest of the wealthy. And so it seems to me that all the data suggests this. So consequently, and we'll get into this a little bit more because I have some of the data here in one of the pieces that I want to share with you today, but it stands to reason then that if all the data is telling us that most of the benefits and most of the profits have been enjoyed by a very, very small percentage of the population, which is partly responsible for the tremendous increase in gap inequality in America, the incredible inequities in the distribution of wealth and income in America. It's pretty obvious that the performance of the market is part of this. And so it stands to reason that most of the individuals who are making, you know, who are reaping the benefits of the 27% increase in the Dow are large investment firms or incredibly competent and wealthy individuals who are playing the market at a level which would allow them to derive the most benefit from these kinds of increases. The little investor obviously is one who cannot afford to engage a financial advisor or a personal financial advisor. It's kind of like who has a personal attorney, who has a family attorney, and who doesn't in American society. And it's very obvious that there's a certain element of the population that engages an attorney, that feels the need to engage an attorney. And the same kind of thing is true with financial advisors. Most people who are into the market, and this is one of the points that I want to make, anybody who's involved in any kind of a retirement program is involved in the market, because by definition, investment firms, financial investment firms who offer retirement plans and retirement programs, 401ks and all the rest, are investing this retirement money in the market. And it's that incredible increase that caused the Dow to go up so high from the late 80s and into the 90s. The emergence, in other words, the emergence of 401ks and the decline of defined benefit pension programs coincides with the tremendous increase in the Dow. And so obviously what that is created by is this incredible influx of pension funds into the market.
Hey, Dr. Bill?
Yes, Bob.
I don't want to interrupt for too long, but Darlene has called to continue or round out your conversation.
Okay.
So, you know, at your leisure.
Well, right now, Bob. Be great.
All right, thanks.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Hello, Darlene.
Hi, Dr. Bill. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Cold, but pretty good.
There you go.
Yeah.
I wanted to finish up the conversation from yesterday.
Right ahead.
I guess we had been talking about the volatility of currency back in the late 1700s, and with a historical figure that I was researching out in my area, and how you really brought it in real nicely with the Constitution being established, certainly in part to protect creditors,
right,
as opposed to the debtors. And in this area where I'm living, they had this thing called the Bulkley Bill they were trying to institute to try to protect the debtor. And the Constitution was not really would prevent or bar that kind of legislation.
That kind of legislation, right?
Yeah,
you've got it exactly.
And the interesting thing was that out in this area, it wasn't like there were a lot of debtors or debtors' prisons. It was actually not a very significant problem. I think if there was any debt to anyone, it was, locally, like one person to another.
Right.
But I guess that there was such a heightened sense of not being imposed upon in any respect, because people were contributing not only treasure but blood and treasure to the war effort. They were beginning to rebel against any kind of oppression, whether it came from like a consociation of churches or association of ministers trying to dictate to the local churches. So they would start, the local churches would start railing, and the townspeople would start railing against the religious establishment. And there were other things that were popping up that people at that time were becoming very intolerant of. And I think the Bulkley Bill was sort of one of those, was sort of an angle on that, where they were saying, well, how it was sort of like a jubilee, I guess, in a sense, to help people who might be debtors not be thrown in prison and not lose everything because of that.
Sure.
And it was that same sort of idea against oppression, because they were fighting a war to stop the oppression from Great Britain. So they certainly were saying, well, we're not going to having fought like this and died for this, we're certainly not going to have it, internalized in this country and then foisted on us again from within this country.
Right.
And then, of course, the Constitution kind of put a stop to that.
Yeah, it certainly did.
And so moving forward, I had left off with how, like today's stock market, how kind of overwhelming the idea is of trying to invest in the stock market. And you were talking about the real high, stock market returns, the Dow Jones, 16,000 points, and
yeah, it's 16.5 today.
And to me, and you pointed out how that's been sustained for quite a while, which is sort of falling outside the average time frame for a correction. And from my perspective, that screams bubble. To me, it's like that's a big red flag. And of course, I am worried about investing in the stock market. I feel like it's a gambling casino. And to me, I remember very well the housing bubble. And I remember reading, because I was looking for a house at that time. And I didn't make the mistake that many people made at that time by buying into that housing market where the home prices were incredibly exorbitant. And I remember reading this article by a real estate agent who just wrote this long, long piece about how there was no housing bubble and why there wasn't a bubble, And obviously she was wrong.
Yeah.
Because it was proven that there had been a housing bubble. And I'm wondering, I don't know if you're seeing anything out there about anyone justifying the current, wonderfully high stock market returns. Because to me, if there's anyone out there justifying that, I would think that would also be a red flag, that something isn't right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thing that's also rather disconcerting, I guess, is that everything has become so computerized, and that I guess they can make trades.
Yeah.
Online. Split second.
Yeah. They call day traders, and I've read about them. I'm not in that category, but these people basically buy and sell online instantaneously. And so consequently, they're moving so much money around that every once in a while you'll see where the market will respond to a particular deal or a particular trade. It'll go way up or way down depending on what happens and at a particular time. And a lot of these so-called hedge fund people, these hedge fund organizations are involved in that. And what of course, what the hedge funds are apparently, from what I read, very risky. But on the other hand, they promise the biggest bang for your buck. In other words, if you happen to hit it right, there's an opportunity to make an incredible amount of money. And the hedge funds only deal in large volumes.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so consequently, they are able to affect the performance of the market in ways, and of course what all of this means, it's extremely complicated, it's mm-hmm. extremely complex. And what it has done is it's almost forced government to become much more of a regulator, much more provide much more oversight. But these people have become so shrewd that they're able to operate in ways that a lot of times government regulators, it takes them a while to catch up. They're always 2 or 3 steps behind, naturally, mm-hmm. And it is incredible. It's incredibly risky, but it's especially from what I read about the hedge funds. But the potential profits are incredible. And these people only deal with, as I say, in large volumes, and that kind of volume can affect the performance of the market. And the reason I'm saying that is because most of us don't have that kind of, in other words, our little piddly amount is so small that it would get lost in. So what they do is they assemble a lot of individual small accounts until they have a big account. And so what they're effectively doing is gambling with and we're buying the chips, mm-hmm. and they're investing.
I would think with those large hedge funds, though, I would think you wouldn't even be able to really buy your way into them. I mean, wouldn't there be a?
Yeah, they would go out in search of clients, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I don't think the clients seek them out. I think they seek the clients out. Mm-hmm. And at least that's what I've always assumed. But the fact of the matter is that, traditionally, and I think this really kind of ties in with what you're into. Traditionally, the major argument in favor of the market was that in the long term, over time, and I remember when growing up, we were always encouraged to know that you don't get into the market with the idea of making a profit and buying and selling over the weekend and that kind of thing, which is what's going on now. That what the argument used to be, and I'm talking 60s, 70s, 80s. The argument was that you buy a that you purchase stock in companies that are not going to go bankrupt. General Motors used to be kind of the most solid rock of all, like the Prudential rock. And but the argument is that that you're not going to make an incredibly large profit overnight, but these large, dependable, well-managed companies over time are pretty certain to bear benefits. So and so investors, small investors, are encouraged. Consequently, look for the long term. Don't look at the short term. Look at the long term. Right. And the fact of the matter is, in society today, as you know, everybody's looking for the quick hit, mm-hmm. and so and corporations and companies have done that. I mean, they have monthly reports. I get just in my retirement stuff, I get a monthly report and a quarterly report, and what you're looking for are quarterly dividends or quarterly profit margins and all the rest of it. And so consequently, companies are forced to manage in such a way that they can demonstrate to stockholders short-term advantages. So what that means is that that what's happening in the market today runs totally contrary to what many of us were told about the market when we were encouraged to get into it. that it was long-term, it was secure, it was stable, it was gradual. It had its ups and it had its downs. But the argument is just to keep, just to stick with it, and eventually, almost invariably, you'll realize a profit. In fact, one of my good friends is a financial advisor, and his argument all the time is when the market goes down, that's the time to buy, because that means that the value of stock is going down, and you can buy good stock cheap. Right. It's like, he calls it a fire sale. Yeah. He said when the market, when the market drops a couple of 100 points, it's like a fire sale, because a lot of people will panic and sell, and that's the time you want to go in and buy and all this. And of course, what that says about him is that he has this incredible faith in the market.
Yeah.
And, and consequently, it's that faith and that trust that he sells to his clients, and he's very, very sincere about it, and because he believes in it, and I mean, that's his degree, that's what his training is about, and he's been in it for a lot of years, and that's what he does, and so that's kind of what we were when I was growing up. That's what we were encouraged to believe, that you don't, it's not like going to Las Vegas at the roulette table and looking to make $500,000 on one roll or anything like that. But in effect, that's what's happening today.
Right.
And so it's really creating a contradiction between what people were told and what, in fact, the market is doing. And I agree with you. I find it a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit shaky, and because you really don't know what's happening. You don't really understand it. You just have to have faith in the people, that are investing your money.
Exactly, and I think the other layer to this too is socially conscious investing, which I don't necessarily think that the stock market, in a predominant sense, really gives you. I have some real difficulty, throwing, and this is what you're supposed to do. They talk about diversify.
Right.
So I could hand over a certain amount of money to an investor or a financial advisor to invest, and probably in order to see some kind of a return after the fees are taken out, may very well mean that they're going to take that money and invest in a coal company or an oil company or natural gas or things that really don't sit well with me.
Right.
In terms
I know
of
exactly what you mean.
And it's like, I don't want to be giving my hard-earned money to these
right.
groups and these companies, these corporations. I don't want to be doing that. So they talk. There's a new angle now. Socially conscious or sustainable investments, or trying to invest in sustainable companies. And my guess is that they're onto that. Those that are in the stock market or the corporations, because they're already doing it with our food system, where they're trying to go in and claim something is organic and it isn't, or they're trying to buy up a successful, organic food company. When you have Coca-Cola doing that or whatever, I would assume that the corporations in the stock market are trying to take that angle as well, and claiming that they're socially conscious investing, and here's how or here's why, and in another way to kind of attract different dollars or people that might be having second thoughts about what they're investing in. Mm-hmm. And I don't feel that the system is set up to really encourage that kind of investment and straighten out our world, because we're still seeing damage done to the planet, and I'm sure that is in part encouraged by the stock market, wherein people are investing in those kinds of practices and in these companies. Mm-hmm. This prompted me, and this was years ago before I discovered Bob's program, I had been listening to Air America. Of course, we know what happened with Air America, but after they crashed and burned, there was one gentleman on there who was an investor, a financial advisor, and he had taken on this kind of, he wanted to get into sustainable investing. He had had an epiphany, and he had changed, and he encouraged people to call him, not necessarily on the program, but just to talk to him about getting into investment and doing more sustainable, investing in sustainable companies that were doing good things for the environment. So I did call him. And, we talked for quite a while, and then he set up an appointment over the phone to interview me and take information down, which we did chat, and he seemed very nice, and he said that, 10 years ago, he would not have given me the time of day.
Uh-huh.
He was basically at that point in his life where he was, he had the fancy BMW and racing through the streets of New York and doing, he was a high roller, basically this just high rolling, very successful investor. But I guess he had somehow got real, and it changed. He recommended, and then he wanted to know how much I had in my bank account.
Yeah.
Well, he goes, well, granted, I can tell you I probably had more than most, okay? Yeah. But I guess it wasn't enough for him because he goes, you don't have much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then he goes, and then he tells me about how he was he interviewed a couple that had $450,000 to invest. Mm-hmm. Okay, which that's something that I would be lucky to see half of, for a retirement egg, nest egg. Yep. But this couple apparently had $450,000 to throw into the stock market. Okay, so basically he was telling me, you're mincemeat compared to these individuals.
Right.
Granted, this is before 2007, 2008, so I have to wonder how this wealthy couple fared in the, and you had mentioned that in the stock market, crash of the Great Recession
right.
of that time. And he said, well, he goes, we could probably do a Roth IRA and an IRA for you, which to me I'm thinking there's nothing remarkably new in this. I mean, I could have told myself that, and I didn't necessarily agree with the with the regular IRA. I'd rather do a Roth IRA because of the tax,
taxes, sure.
Taxes. But that's how he ended it off, and he said so-and-so from his office would call me. And during the conversation, we had a nice conversation. He kept saying, darling, you're a very nice person. You're a very nice person. And then he would say, he goes, it's all bull. It's all BS. In reference to the stock market and the financial, he said it's all bull, pucky, all BS. And he said that a few times. And then, of course, I never heard from his office again. Never heard from them. So, and I always was wondering, geez, was it probably because I didn't have enough, to invest, and he really hadn't changed, or maybe he was doing me a favor.
Yeah.
On some level, maybe he just was like, I can't.
You'd like to believe the latter.
Yeah, you'd like to believe the latter, because God only knows what would have happened, because this was before 07, 08.
Sure.
So, to hear somebody who is a financial person basically saying, it's a load of crap. The whole thing is basically, a scam. Is very interesting. And that said, of course, I sort of stopped, and I'm like, well, I don't know what to do about investing. And I did get last year I got a recommendation of a financial investor a financial advisor who I haven't yet seen, because I'm the type of person where I need to get information. I have to collect information and know where I stand. And I know a little bit, I think I know enough to be literate, but I certainly am not very expert in the stock market. And I was like, well, maybe I'll take an adult ed class before I go to see this financial advisor, because at least I want to be able to converse with this person on some intelligent level. So what does a person like me do who really doesn't see a lot of options and is very nervous about investing in the stock market, and maybe I've been good at following my gut. Like I know know when things aren't exactly on the up and up. Well, right. The alternative used to be interest on your savings in the bank.
No, that's gone.
Well, right. When was the last time we saw anything a little bit over 6% interest?
Oh, yeah.
Clinton administration. That's my recollection. Is that your recollection?
And those are the people. That's what working people did with their money, is they basically put it in the bank, or we were encouraged to save. I can remember I was at school when we used to get we had stamp books. And you'd fill the book, and you buy, like, I can remember each week, my dad would give me a quarter, and we'd buy one stamp. And then, I don't know, I can't remember how long it took, but when you finished the book, you would take it to the bank, and you would get a $25 Series E savings bond, and it would cost you $17.75 for a $25 bond, and you had to hold it for 10 years. And if you held it to maturity, you'd have $25. And that's what everybody that I knew, that I went to school with, that's what our whole future idea of saving and investing and all of that was all there was.
Sure.
And now that's gone. I mean, you can't, they don't even want your money anymore, so consequently they're not paying you any interest for it.
Exactly, and it's basically all free money. I view it as free money to the banks.
Yeah.
They can do what they will with it. You're getting a pittance back for interest. My father, who is in his late 70s, is very upset about this because he never, he raised me and my siblings at a time, my parents, basically my mom was stay at home, and my father was able to raise us on his little business. He was self-employed, put me through college and law school, and he was able to do all of that on one income. And he did not invest in the stock market, but he was able to save up quite a bit, which, of course, the government took half of it away from him when my mother wound up having to go on Title 19 due to a stroke. And I feel really bad for him, and I'm outraged that they did that to him because I don't feel they should have done that to him.
Right.
He did all of this, and he was relying on living off some of the interest of his little nest egg that he had saved up for him and my mother. Mm-hmm. And of course, he was very upset talking about it today, about how there's nothing. You're getting nothing from the banks anymore. They're getting all that money for nothing.
And they're coming up with all of these kinky fees.
Exactly.
And,
mm-hmm. And also the minimums, which is another thing that makes me crazy because I opened a business account with my local bank, which I feel like once you give them their money, they don't want to give it back. That's my attitude. But it was all too good to be true. But they suckered in a bunch of us at that point in time. It was basically no fees. It was a real easy business account, no minimum, nothing like that. Within less than 30 days, supposedly the banking regulations had suddenly changed, like they didn't know this was coming, and all of a sudden now you have to keep a minimum $2,500 minimum in your checking account, the business account, which is not getting interest. Okay, that $2,500 is not getting interest, and if you don't, then you get a service fee every month.
Yep.
Okay, and so to me, that's money I'm losing. That's money that they get and that I have to keep in there no matter what, so I don't get that $10 fee or whatever it is now. And to me, that's free money for them to wheel and deal with. And I find that, so they've taken away that option to try to at least overcome the depletion of your money over time. So what other options are there? I guess to try to win the lottery. Maybe that's something you could try to do.
Buy Powerball tickets with it, and
which
So basically, it's the market. I mean, and that's the idea. I mean, historically, and I usually that's usually where I come from. But historically, in the 20s, for example, and reading in the history of the 1920s, prior to the Great Depression, and in the so-called Jazz Age, the Roaring 20s, one of the concerns was unions and Bolshevism, communism, and Marxist-Leninism, and the fear was that communists were going to infiltrate the country. This was right after World War I into the early 1920s. And so the country experienced this incredible Red Scare in 1919, 1920. And there was so much union activity after World War I that companies obviously blamed it on communists and socialists. And the argument was that the unions have been infiltrated by all these radicals from Southern and Eastern Europe, who were raised on Marxist, Leninist, and the communist revolution and overthrowing capitalism and all the rest of it. So consequently, they created such a climate in America that government came down hard on unions and radicals and free speech and media, and it was incredible. But one of the things that came out of this was corporations, and the argument was that one of the ways that you can decrease or combat workers' inclinations to unionize is to make them is to get them invested in the market. Communists, obviously don't invest in Wall Street, and so the assumption is that the more people you could persuade to get into investing in the market, the more you would be combating popular inclination towards unions and towards radicalism and everything else. So companies began to, employers began to offer stock options to employees as a way, by making them a partial owner of the company. That was a way to decrease interest in and support for unions. And so it was a conscious effort. So they were talking about the fact that, in the 1920s, that this is what we've got to do, is we've got to find ways to get more people invested in the market, because it tends to temper radicalism. And it makes people, by making them investors, you're making them mini capitalists. And as such, that's what they were talking about, and there were conscious programs designed to encourage that and to do it. And then, of course, the whole thing exploded in 1929 with the crash, and we entered into the 1930s and the Great Depression, and what happened after that with Roosevelt's New Deal and the emergence of minimum wage and Social Security and the right of unions to organize and collective bargain and all the rest of it came out of the Depression. And of course, corporations and capitalists were calling Roosevelt a communist. Because of the New Deal programs, and one of his most famous quotes was, "This isn't communism. This is the shrewdest form of capitalism. If you're going to preserve this system, you've got to find ways to get more people invested in it."
And also to preserve their necks, the extremely wealthy.
Oh, of course, the people that are doing the best benefit from this. But that's kind of what we're into right now, because unions are in an incredible decline in the country right now, and a lot of it is, according to this article that I've been using here, 50% of the working population is somehow invested in the market. It is investing in stocks, in the stock market, one way or the other. Well, that's much better than it used to be, but the point is, to many people today, 50% is not enough.
Right.
And they want, they're really trying to find ways. So that's what happened with 401ks and George Bush's idea of privatizing Social Security and all the rest of it. In other words, the more people you can get invested in the market, the more secure the financial system becomes. And
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. You're fine.
We tend to, this country tends to always ruin everything. We tend to go to like what they call, we always seem to get to the cancer stage of things, because you're talking about how they were trying to encourage employees to invest in the company that they were working at, which leads me to automatically think the extreme of that, Enron. in terms of what happened. Was that in the 90s with the whole debacle with Enron?
Oh, yeah. And those people had everything they had invested in that one company.
And the interesting thing was that they were these employees were blamed. Oh, you should have known better. You should have diversified. Meanwhile, who knows what kind of pressure the company leaders and management were putting on the employees, plus the outright the lies that they were promoting that Enron was, a strong sailing ship in terms of its finances.
Right.
And I suppose was Ken Lay. I guess that was he was lucky that he was able to check out basically, and got off easy because he died.
Yeah, he died. Yeah.
So things like that. I don't know. Maybe it's sticking in the collective memory of where people are getting repeatedly screwed over like this with investments. Hence, the 50% that you mentioned in terms of only 50% are invested. I think that's it's kind of a unimpressive percentage, quite frankly.
Yeah.
But I have to wonder if this kind of repeated highs and lows of the economy and people being screwed over periodically in a manner such as what happened with Enron and in 07 and 08 is making people rather shy of investing. Even so, in spite of that, we're still seeing what they now are calling two economies.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, the economy's doing great, because the Dow Jones is doing great. Well, everybody on the ground or on the street, they talk about Main Street versus Wall Street. Everybody knows we're not doing well economically.
A lot of people are not. That's right. A few people are, and it's a shrinking number of people that are, and that's really what's frightening. And it frightens me because that's what we've been talking here about these efforts to attack government, this anti-government campaign, this anti-big government, and those people who are arguing that we need to become more austere. We need to focus on the deficit and on the size of the deficit. We need to do everything we can to shrink entitlement programs. We need to get government out of people's lives. When in fact, in the fact of the matter is, the only thing that's keeping a lot of people afloat is the fact that government's in their lives. I mean, and we're dealing, as you mentioned, with a lot of people that don't know this. I mean, and I don't know it. I mean, I consider myself pretty well educated, but this is all stuff that I don't know.
The derivatives are I think they're purposefully making it very complex.
Well, that's the whole point. Yeah. And see, everything yesterday that we were talking about yesterday was based on the assumption that the whole thing is on the up and up, and this is the way it's supposed to work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then you look at Elizabeth Warren's speech in the Senate. She talks about these duplicitous firms that are putting together these very questionable packages, investment schemes, and selling them. One of the things, for example, and I don't know enough to criticize anybody. All I'm doing is throwing things out. But one of the things I thought of, because I own my home. I mean, I was able to pay off my house a couple of years ago.
Congratulations. Very good.
Well, I mean, it used to be something that you dream about, is owning your own home and not having a mortgage payment, and I had a small second, and I'm still paying on that, but it's very, very small. And so anyway, now that I'm retired, or moving into retirement, I've been hearing all of these things on television about reverse mortgages, and I'm thinking, that's not a bad idea. And one of the concerns, one of the issues I have, is that reverse mortgages are good for certain people, but not good for everybody. So you really need to do some reading and some research and find out. So I said, well, I'm going to check into that, because one of the things I have is that my wife has children from her previous marriage. But I don't have any of my own children. So I have a brother and sister, but I don't, and I have nephews and nieces and that kind of thing. But I don't have anybody to leave my house to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking to myself, I mean, I'm a perfect candidate for the reverse mortgage idea because I'm looking to I put all of this investment in this, everything I've got's in this house. So I'm thinking to myself, well, now I'm going to turn around and let the house take care of me for a while.
Okay.
And so the reverse mortgage sounds good. So anyway, I have a good friend here, a couple of good friends that, and they're financial advisors. And one of them is this very young guy, and I've only known him a couple of years, but he's a really, really nice guy, and we've gotten to be pretty good friends. And so I talked to him, and I said, I'm really curious about, can you tell me? And he said, well, it's a good opportunity for me to do some research. Give me a couple of weeks. Let me pull together some stuff, and then we'll just sit down over coffee, and we'll talk about it. So anyway, he called me and he said, I got some information on reverse mortgage. Let's meet for breakfast one morning. So we did. And he said, well, you got to be careful. And he said, first of all, there's nobody in this entire community that deals in reverse mortgages. The only people that deal with them are people out of state with 800 numbers or on TV or something like that. It's the large investors. And I'm thinking, so there's nobody local. So you're dealing with an amorphous firm that doesn't have real people in it, and I'm thinking,
long wait times on the phone, Dr. Bill.
Yeah. And then he said fees, and he said you got to be careful of the fees. And so he did some numbers for me, and I gave him some of my own information. And he said about my house, and he said basically, if you did a reverse mortgage, you're looking at $12,000 in fees right off the top. In other words, whatever your house is worth, deduct $12,000 from that because it's going to go in fees to get the reverse mortgage. But then he said, on the other hand, it's not, in many ways, it's not a bad program for you, but you got to be careful. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, one of the requirements of all reverse mortgage programs is that you have to live in the house for 6 months of the year. And of course, the reason for that is the firm that's bankrolling this, the banks or whoever, it's a government secured program and they advertise that all the time. But the fact of the matter is they recognize that at some point in time they're liable to end up with this house. So they want to make sure that you take care of the house. And they know that the people who live in their own home take the best care of it rather than renters. Right. So consequently, the requirement of the reverse mortgage program is that you have to live in your house 6 months. Well, the problem is when you're talking about retired people, many people become ill. And he said, for example, if you were struck ill and you were put in some sort of a rehab situation where, you had a heart attack or a stroke or something, and you were put in a rehab situation where they were rehabilitating you for a couple, if it went on for more than 6 months, you'd be homeless.
Oh my God!
Because they take you home. If you don't live in it, if you violate the terms of the deal and you don't live in it for 6 months, they take your house.
Oh my gosh!
And he said, so you don't want to do that. Wow. And I said, well, I'd have never found that out.
Yeah.
I'd have never known that. And so those are the kinds of things. And I'm saying, it's not that we're being given false information. It's the fact that we're being given selective information.
Mm-hmm.
Being told the good stuff, but not the bad stuff.
Right.
It's like you're socially conscious investor.
Yeah.
You'd like to believe that there's more of that out there than there is, but. So anyway, my feeling is that this is all information that people have to, that people need to know because it's affecting all of us.
Yeah.
And we're woefully ignorant as a population. That's one of the reasons I wanted to raise this thing, because you're right. What we do is when things go bad, we blame the ignorant. Mm-hmm. We blame the people who are the victims.
Well, I would think like. Sort of on that note, the whole thing, and I brought this up when I talked to Bob on his program a couple of weeks back about the recent, so-called budget deal that stopped the long-term unemployment for over 1 million people who can't find work. And I think Robert Reich has been, he's been saying, there are not enough jobs out there for these individuals, that there are more unemployed than there are available jobs. And I'm glad that, he's saying that, and I think he's getting some, he's getting some airtime on this. And so, again, the tendency is to blame the person who can't find the job, and that, or the poor individual, and this whole thing, and I know the Senate is trying to get an extension for a couple of months, big deal, but they're trying to do something, and Susan Collins, senator, I don't know if she's from Maine, I can't, is she a senator or House of Reps?
She's a senator.
Senator, I think she said, well, and I get insane when I hear this. It just makes me so angry and so infuriated when, we have to find an offset. And people should be in the streets, they should be screaming from the rooftops and saying, well, how come you never talk about an offset for the oil companies that are getting subsidies from us when they don't need it? The wealthy oil companies that are getting all this money going to them, and they're already wealthy. Again, there's the wealth transfer. The wealth transfer that has actually occurred is from the bottom up. And, we're not, and to sit there and say, well, we have to have an offset to help these people survive, to me is outrageous. And in a sense, it's still blaming them for an economy and a job situation that's not their fault.
I'm thinking of this, and this is just information, but you might be interested in this. There's a book that came out on the Constitution, and it's called Unruly Americans. And the author of it teaches history at the University of Richmond in Virginia, and basically his theme is exactly what you're saying, is that the transition from the Confederation period after independence, the Confederation period, to the Constitution. In the Confederation period, power was on the local level, was in the states rather than the central government. And what that meant was that real power was closer to the people than it ever was before or since. And what that meant was, and this gets right back to your Bulkley law, that what that meant was that state legislatures were where the power was, and people were directly able to get at them. And so consequently, popular pressure, public opinion, was much more powerful than it ever has been since, because you could literally get to the people who had the power to affect your life in terms of taxes and debts and loans and the value of money and all the rest of it. So consequently, governments were inclined more during this period to pass laws like this Bulkley law that you talked about, which made things other than gold and silver legal tender. So you could use it to pay debts and pay taxes. You could use chickens and cows and corn and wheat and everything else to pay debts and pay off your obligations. And the creditor people were totally opposed to that. I mean, they were out of their minds, because government was literally governing in the public interest, they felt, in too many cases. And consequently, contracts were being violated. I mean, I signed a contract with you. You're supposed to pay me so much a month, and then the government comes along and says, wait a minute, there's a recession going on. People can't get jobs. So therefore, they pass a law that says that you don't have to pay me for the money you owe me for the next 6 months. And I'm going, I said, wait a minute, that's not fair, Yeah. And so consequently, I'm looking for a change. So along comes James Madison and those who are promoting the strengthening of the central government and ultimately the Constitution. And so it becomes very clear which people are supporting it and which people oppose it. And so there's this massive PR campaign to get the people to ratify the Constitution. But in order to do that, they're very, very selective on what they tell people. If you read the Federalist Papers and read the Anti-Federalist Papers, it becomes very clear that this is a very complex, complicated situation, and people are being frightened into supporting the Constitution when, in fact, it's largely big money people that are promoting it. And what it does is it takes power away from the states and lodges it in the central government. So what you're doing is denying the states the power to respond to the needs of their own people any longer. And that's really what was going on. And it's not totally bad. It's not totally conspiratorial, because Madison and the others are right. And they're saying, there's no way in the world that this country can make it unless people in other countries are willing to invest in us. And we've got to pay our obligations. We've got to let the world know that we pay our bills. And so consequently, what we need to do is stress the idea of how important it is to pay your bills and to meet your obligations and be responsible and all the rest of it. That's the only way we're going to get support from other nations. That's the only way we're going to build trade. That's the only way we're going to get people to invest in manufacturing in this country and all the rest of it. And that's what economic development's about. So there's a real legitimate reason for doing this, and the Constitution makes that possible. But the fact of the matter is, the average person doesn't understand all the details, and he's being fed a bill of goods. But very honestly, he's being frightened and into doing it. The closing speech at the Constitutional Convention was delivered by Benjamin Franklin. He was in his 80s. And he said basically, this Constitution, every one of us would change something in it. If you read this, he said, every one of us has something we don't like in it. But he said the bottom line is we've got to get this thing passed. And so what we all need to do is agree that when we leave this hall, as far as we're concerned, this is the most perfect piece of legislation ever created by the mind of man. And what we need to do is suspend all the things we would change. There's an amendments provision in the Constitution where if it doesn't work, we can fix it. But the bottom line is we got to get this thing through. So our job is to go back to our states and sell this thing and point out that if we don't pass this, revolution and total breakdown of law and order in society will happen. And if people are confronted with that, it's either this or anarchy. People will support it. And that's the context within which the Constitution is ratified.
Well, and I agree with you on that, about how, back then, I guess during the time of the Articles of Confederation, you're basically saying that public opinion had a great deal more power. I would agree with that because that's the sense that I got in studying this historical figure, this minister.
And the reason is because government is so close.
Yeah. The
people knew who their representatives were.
Yeah, they were in his face. Yeah,
you knew where they lived, and your kids went to school with their kids, and all the rest of it. And so consequently, government had no choice but to be much more responsive to the needs of the people. And the most interesting thing is, if you look at the various states under the Confederation, because they were all independent countries, really, they were united in the Articles of Confederation as what they called the League of Friendship, but it wasn't a government over them. It was a confederation made up of free and independent states. And if you look at the constitutions of each one of them, it's very interesting. The constitutions that were most conservative, the ones that were most friendly to the creditor interests and most unfriendly to the debtor interests, are the ones that experienced revolutions. The so-called Shays Rebellion in Massachusetts is one example. Massachusetts had the most conservative constitution of any of them, and it experienced Shays Rebellion. And the reason was because creditors controlled the government to the point that government was unlikely or unwilling to come to the support of its own people by passing paper money laws and stay laws and payment installment laws and suspending taxes and all the rest of it. So consequently, the people whose homes were being foreclosed on and sold finally took matters into their own hands, and they just basically began to close the courts and took up arms and basically were in rebellion. And the states where that were more inclined to respond to the needs of their people didn't experience the rebellions. And so it was it's really interesting to to look at these things. But the point is that the ignorance that we've been talking about how the market works and how investment works and all the rest of it, is part of the reason why we've had such difficulty in understanding history. Mm-hmm. Because history is the same thing, and we've been denied the opportunity to learn it. Mm-hmm. And so consequently, what we've been given is kind of the establishment interpretation of history. And so consequently, like this program, I mean, I get emails and calls from people that are saying, I didn't know that about the Constitution, I had no idea that that's what the Constitution was about. And the point is, the reason is because we've never been given the opportunity to understand it. If we really been taught history, then people would be much more knowledgeable and much more informed about investment, and about the market, and about the issue of inequality, and about socially conscious investing, and all of these other things. Would have a much more knowledgeable, informed electorate. Yeah. But there's always, throughout our history, been a reluctance to do that, and so consequently, we've throughout history, we've been much more inclined to turn the major decisions over to the few.
Right. Well, I also think in this culture, unfortunately, there's a premium placed on ignorance. That to an extent, anyone that is a thinker or is intellectual or wants to know these things are kind of put down in a way. They're a nerd, or they're, there's. I almost feel like there's a premium placed on ignorance. Which just seems so, and you can't really have a well-functioning country or, hopes of some sort of a democracy eventually with that kind of mentality.
No.
And I guess the larger question is, what do we do in terms of the Constitution? Because, before listening to your program, I thought it was, and it is a remarkable document. We can't.
Oh, it's fabulous.
Yeah, but obviously, at least in part, it's not necessarily based on something that's totally good or above board, or, there were certain nefarious reasons behind why it was created in part. To me, that worries me. How do we level that out? How do we build a nation on something that's not 100%? I don't know what the word do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. And there's because once you begin to get into some of this stuff, then I find this with students a lot of times that they're inclined to go immediately towards the idea the whole thing is a conspiracy. Mm-hmm. It's all conspiratorial. You can't trust anybody. Everybody has an agenda. Blah blah blah. And that's kind of overreaction, I think. And I believe that the answer is education. And I believe that one of the deal that we've never been willing to make in this society is to trust the idea that everybody ought to have the opportunity to be educated to their full potential, whatever that happens to be. And, everybody can't make it all the way through Harvard. Everybody's not going to be able to do that. But everybody ought to be able to be given the chance to at least find out whether they can or not. And to assume that because of the neighborhood you grew up in, or the house you live in, or the kind of car your parents in, to make an assumption from that you're not Harvard material, and to basically dumb down the quality of the education that you're given, because the assumption is you're only going to end up working in a factory anyway, or you're going to be the best thing you can be is a mechanic or something like that. And that's what we've done. We've tended to stereotype people based on things that aren't necessarily accurate. Sometimes they are, but oftentimes they're not. And we're taking little children, and we're basically, from the very beginning, we're sending them the message in our education system that their potential is very limited, and that they need to become realistic about what they want to do in life and what they can't do. And I really believe that that's where That's where our hope is. We've got to basically begin to turn our system around and begin to educate people to their full potential, rather than just assuming that there's only a certain portion of the people out there that can really handle real education.
But isn't there and not to sound conspiratorial, but hasn't there always been an effort, I think, by, I call them the moneyed classes, or quote-unquote betters, the elite, if you will, many of whom were the men that created, that developed the Constitution.
Sure.
There's always been that effort afoot to keep the population dumbed down to a certain extent. And because the more dumbed down you are, the more you can kind of control them. I mean, look at what's happening now in keeping people divided.
Yeah.
On issues that you've talked about really should not be politicized,
That's right.
On abortion and
the death penalty and things like that.
All those things. Yeah. In a sense, we can never really move forward because we're so embroiled against each other, and we're not, we're seeing that people aren't being educated well, or that there is an effort to keep people dumbed down. That's a real tough thing to
and a lot of it is fear.
Overcome.
A lot of it is fear. And one of the pieces of legislation, I jump all over this all the time, but in 1816, right after the War of 1812, the Senate, the United States Senate, passed a bill taxing books from other countries coming into the United States. It was like taxing Toyotas. I mean, it was, it was a huge tax. And what it did was it became so prohibitive that foreign books wouldn't even be able to sell in the United States because the cost of them was so prohibitive because of the tax. And the champion in the Senate gives a speech, and I have a copy of it, and he talks about why we need to do this in order to protect our young people from foreign dangerous ideas. And so basically, this was 1816, and to his credit, the person that spoke out the loudest against this was Thomas Jefferson. Because I believe that Jefferson really believed in the idealism of the Declaration. I really think he did. I don't think it's an accident, for example, that the Declaration, before it talks about inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, it talks about equality. And I don't think that that's an accident. And then Jefferson goes to France, and he's in France. He's ambassador to France during the Washington administration, and he's over in France as Secretary of State, and until he comes back to be Secretary of State, and he works with Lafayette on the French during the early parts of the French Revolution, on the French Declaration of Citizen Rights and Liberties. And he's much more expansive and outspoken than our document is about what he means by that. And I really think he's a classic liberal. He believes that he basically talks about virtue, and he said, that if you believe in God, then you have to believe that God would not create mankind to live in a society unless man was naturally inclined to be good to each other rather than hostile and competitive with each other. And his argument is that the right to conscience, the ability to know right from wrong is innate. Jefferson really believed that. And he also said part of the goal of our education system is, like any other trait, it can be strengthened with exercise. And so the argument is what we need to do is use the education system to encourage virtue and make people even more virtuous they are, because when they get out of school, they're going to have to live with other people, and we're going to have to survive in communities, and we're going to have to pull together and all this other stuff. He really believed this stuff, and I admire the heck out of that, Yeah. So anyway, I guess I'm not necessarily that cynical, but it's hard sometimes not to be.
Yeah.
But Darlene, I thoroughly enjoyed talking with you. This is wonderful.
I enjoyed talking to you too, Dr. Bill, and thank you very much for schooling me on all of this.
Well, I don't know how much, but you might want to look at this Unruly Americans book.
Yeah, this sounds interesting.
The author's name is Woody Holton, Holton.
Okay.
And he teaches history at the University of Richmond. The book is available on Kindle. I have it on Kindle.
Oh, good. Okay.
And it's almost free. It's like $1.99 or something.
Oh, that's cool. Okay.
And basically, it's on the Confederation period. And the point he makes in this, he's talking about government coming to the aid of people. But the point he makes is the worst thing that the supporters of the Constitution did was that they blamed the failures of the Confederation period on the poor, on the ignorant and the uneducated. Basically, the argument was what we did is we came out of the War for Independence, we created a real republic with the closest we've ever had to democratic government in this country, where government really responded to the needs of its own people. And his point is that when it became clear that we had too much faith in virtue and people's willingness to do the right thing unless they were forced to, then in order to get the Constitution, we turn around and blame the very people that that blame the failures of Republican government on the people, on the poor and on the uneducated and on the young, and his argument is that's totally unfair. That in a sense, that's like blaming the ignorant today for saying, well, you should know better. It's a free country. You could have gone out and learned all that stuff.
Right. The whole that's sort of the same concept, like pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, kind of.
Exactly. Right. Right.
And I would also think it would play into the whole idea of trying to push for a constitution to begin with. It's like, well, by blaming the ignorant, that sort of,
right.
would.
I can remember when I wrote my dissertation, my doctoral dissertation on this stuff, and I'll never forget when I wrote my master's thesis, and my advisor, who has since passed, he came in and he basically asked me. He said, basically in 50 words or less, what is your thesis about what is your interpretation as to what the Constitution was about? And I said, the whole idea of the Constitution is to move power from the local level to the national level in order to make it less likely that the people would have access to power. And the reason, like in the state that I studied, which was Maryland, in Maryland, what I argued in my dissertation and what my thesis was that the people who supported the Constitution in Maryland were very aware of the deal, of the bargain that they were making. What they were basically saying is, what we have to do is surrender the power we have to respond to the people by moving it to the central government, because that's the only way that we can answer the people when they come to us and ask for something. We can say, we can't do that anymore, only the national government can. So basically what they did is they gave up their power, the power to respond directly to the needs of their people by supporting the Constitution, but they were willing to do that. And and he kept saying, if you can prove this, you don't need me. That's what he used to say all the time. But
that's disturbing.
But basically, what my thesis is, that it was and still is that it's not power per se; it's where you put it. And if you put it too close to the people, then they can get it. And the way they can get it is through the idea of majority rule in the ballot box. Yeah. So what you do is you locate, as Madison said in Federalist Number 10. You take away certain powers and you put them in the central government. You still have majority rule, but now the only time you can affect change is if the national majority supports it. And his argument is that's unlikely to happen. But now with technology and the information revolution, it is happening through cell phones and various other things. So we now are, and I think the Tea Party is proving that now it's possible to organize, movements on the national level, and Madison never envisioned.
Right, because we're so big a country, but that now that the internet is kind of making it
smaller again,
condensing it in a sense, So I guess you're putting some hope in
I think education has to be the answer. I believe that. But anyway, I sure have enjoyed talking with you, Darlene.
Same here. All right. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you very much, Darlene.
Okay. Bye-bye.
We're at 25 minutes after the hour in the East, 5 o'clock. Let me give you the phone number again and encourage you to call. I thoroughly enjoyed the last hour and a half. I just thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. Our phone number is area code 304-658-3333. That's 304-658-3333. And again, my email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly, waobrien906@gmail.com. Darlene raised so many points. We started with the volatility in the value of money. And, of course, what makes that issue so significant to me is because it is possible to create the kind of environment which will affect the value of money. And what I mean by that is, since value is based on trust, then anything you can do to weaken trust devalues money. And what that means is, if money it's like stocks, the value of stocks. If the market continues to go down, then some people are going to panic, and immediately they're going to say, oh, I better get out before it goes any lower, before I lose any more. And so consequently, people are willing to dump stock when the market goes down. And the shrewd investor knows that that's the time to come in and buy it. It's like flipping real estate. People who buy fix-up homes and fix them up and turn them over at a very substantial profit. One of the things I've noticed, for example, in my reading of history over the years, is that most people's fortunes have been made one way or another in dealing with the issue of property. And of course, with the emergence of the Industrial Revolution and with the emergence of the modern age, property ceases to be just land and physical property and becomes investment property as well. And so things like security and investments and retirement, pensions and all of that become they all have a value. They all become commodities with a dollar value. And so what we have as a society, as we've been talking about now, where people are willing to wheel and deal in these commodities. And so therefore, to be able to anticipate, and that's really what we're talking about, to be able to anticipate the ups and downs. And what makes it difficult and complex is the fact that everybody is not in there playing, dealing from the top of the deck, if that makes sense. And I think yesterday we were looking at the speech delivered in the United States Senate on November 18th by Elizabeth Warren. And she raises the issue of, in terms of what she calls a retirement crisis, of what she refers to as unscrupulous financial institutions that are able to package and sell very complicated, complex investment packages to people. And so consequently, people are buying things without really knowing the true cost of credit. And so consequently, they end up slipping into debt. And the fact of the matter is, as she points out, is that now we are in what she calls a retirement crisis as a result. And the fact of the matter is, as people look toward their retirement, they're only now beginning to realize that very few of us, proportionally, have been able to put aside enough money to sustain the standard of living during retirement that we had while we worked. And part of it is because people don't know. As she said, this is a key paragraph, I think. She says, a generation ago, middle-class families were able to put away enough money during their working years to make it through the later years with dignity. On average, they saved about 11% of their take-home pay while working. Many paid off their homes, got rid of all their debts, and retired with strong pensions from their employers. And where pensions, savings, and investments fell short, they could rely on Social Security to make up the difference. The result was that retirement was something to look forward to. Now, granted, because people are living longer, retirement didn't last as long as it does today, and that's really part of the problems. She says that was the story a generation ago, but since then, the retirement landscape has shifted dramatically against families. And this next point is what I'd like to spend a little bit of time on, as we right now we're at the bottom of the hour, so it's 5:30 in the East, so we have just short of a half an hour left in our program today. Among working families on the verge of retirement, she says, about a third have no retirement savings of any kind. Another third have total savings that are less than their annual income. You know, if you work for $40,000 a year, then many people believe that having $40,000 in your retirement is enough. And, of course, by not understanding the way the situation works, they don't realize that it's not nearly enough. Many seniors have seen their housing wealth shrink as well. According to AARP, in 2012, 1 out of every 7 older homeowners is paying down a mortgage that's higher than the value of their home. That's the crisis we just went through as part of the so-called Great Recession. The fact that people were conned into buying more home than they could afford. Many people who already owned their homes were conned into using them as equity to buy more home, to buy a bigger home, or to relocate into a better area. And people were inclined to believe that they could afford more than they could really. So consequently, many of them are what they call underwater at this point because they owe more than their house could sell for. And so the result is that many people have just left, just walked away from the debt and everything else. And so that's part of the housing crisis that we had. I think the numbers in this next section, I think the meat of her point in this speech. And just as they need to rely more than ever on their pensions, employers are withdrawing from their traditional role in helping provide a secure retirement. 2 decades ago, more than a third of all private sector workers, 35%, had traditional defined benefit pensions, pensions that guaranteed a certain monthly payment that retirees knew they could depend on. This is absolutely vital to this whole point, and I think it's critical. For a long time, people worked for employers where they knew that when they retired, they would draw a pension. And what a pension was a defined benefit program. In other words, you knew exactly how much you were going to get every week or twice a month or however often you got your check. And you would get it for life. And you knew that. You knew that when you retired, you had X dollars from your pension. And then when you combine that with Social Security, many people found that they could retire fairly comfortably and still maintain the standard of living. In fact, I know a number of people that have said that the quality of life actually went up when they retired because they didn't have the expenses of a job, they didn't have to buy clothes, they didn't have to put gas in the car all the time, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was 2 decades ago. 35% of working people had traditional defined benefit pensions that guaranteed a certain monthly payment that they knew that they could depend on. Today, that number's been cut in half. 18% of private sector workers still have defined benefit pensions. Employers have replaced guaranteed retirement income with savings plans, like 401ks, that leave the retiree at the mercy of a market that rises and falls, and sometimes at the mercy of dangerous investment products as well. These plans often fall far short of what retirees need, And nearly half of all American workers don't even have access to these limited plans. This leaves more than 44 million working people without any retirement assistance from their employer at all. This, she says, is a retirement crisis because people are going to be living longer. Their retirement is going to be much longer once they stop working. And the fact of the matter is most of them can't help but outlive their retirement income, which means they become totally dependent, 100% on Social Security. Yet Social Security is under attack. That's the program that is causing, that is creating, in her mind, the retirement crisis, the pressure to reduce or change Social Security. She says with less savings and weaker private retirement protection, retirees depend more than ever on the safety and reliability of Social Security. Social Security works. No one runs out of benefits, and the payments don't rise and fall with the stock market. 2/3 of seniors rely on it for the majority of their income in retirement. And for 14 million seniors, 14 million, this is the safety net that keeps them out of poverty. And yet Social Security is now under attack. The average payment per month for Social Security recipients is $1,250. And over time, the benefits are shrinking. This puts a terrible squeeze, she says, on our seniors. So her point is we ought to be looking for ways to expand Social Security, to strengthen it, and actually to increase it in order to improve the quality of life of people who are totally dependent on it. And so her position is that we are indeed in what she calls a retirement crisis. I agree. I really do believe. There are a lot of people out there who want to do something about Social Security. You remember that President Bush suffered politically because of the effort to privatize Social Security. And after the recession of 07-08, many people began to realize, my heavens, what would have happened if we had bought into this idea of privatizing Social Security? Social Security would have been nailed in this recession as well. She points out that Social Security is rapidly becoming the only lifeline that millions of seniors have to keep their heads above water. And yet, instead of taking on the retirement crisis, instead of strengthening Social Security, some in Washington are actually fighting to cut the benefits. And then she said, and this was November 18th, just this morning, she said, the Washington Post ran an editorial mocking the idea of a looming retirement crisis. To make sure no one missed the point, she says, they even put the words retirement crisis in quotation marks. No retirement crisis, she asks? Tell that to the millions of Americans who are facing retirement without a pension. Tell that to millions of Americans who have nothing to fall back on except Social Security. There's a $6.6 trillion gap, she said, between what Americans under 65 are currently saving and what they will need to maintain their current standard of living when they hit retirement. $6.6 trillion. And that assumes Social Security benefits aren't cut. Make no mistake, she said, this is a crisis. And so that's part of the reason why I wanted to raise this issue here at the Virtual Center, because I think it is incredibly important. Darlene raised something that I'd like to address in the time, some of the time that we have left. And I mentioned it in my conversation with her, and I'd like to revisit it a little bit. I made a comment to Darlene about the problems that people have had in understanding history because they are woefully ignorant of some of the things that make history go. some of the, and again, we talk about all of these gimmicks, all of these education strategies designed to improve performance and to improve what people know about their own past and their own country's history and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, we're basically talking, for the most part, to people who really don't understand the basics of what makes society function. And part of it is this conversation we had about investment and the market and securities and the fluctuating value of money and environment and the idea of trust and all the rest of it. And the basic idea, the example that I used yesterday is, I think there's no way in the world to better explain it. Money itself is based on, paper money is based on trust. And what that means is that if I have $5 and I want to buy something for $5, the reason that you'll sell it to me and that you'll take my $5 bill is because you have faith that you can turn around and that $5 that I gave you will still be worth $5 when you choose to buy something and give it to somebody else. In other words, it's the stability of the fact that that $5 will purchase $5 worth of goods. It's that kind of faith that makes the economy go. Otherwise, you wouldn't for a minute think about taking a piece of paper that said $5 in exchange for groceries or gasoline or whatever else you were buying. The only way that you'll trust the paper money is that you trust the value of it. And so so anything that happens that affects that trust directly affects the value of the money. And so people they knew in the 18th century, for example, when they printed paper money, that it would depreciate. The fact of the matter is, the more money there is, the less it's worth. And so as we were talking yesterday in conversation with Darlene, for the poor, inflation has always been good, has always been a positive. And the reason for that is that those people who borrow money, who debtors, those people that owe money, are always benefited by inflation. Because what that means is that the money they pay back is worth less than the money they originally borrowed, if that makes sense. In other words, if I borrow $1,000 from you and I agree to pay it back to you over the next 10 years, by the time we get 6 or 7 or 8 years into the 10-year period, the money that I'm paying you every month on the $1,000 I owe you is worth significantly less than it was when the debt was first incurred. So therefore, the longer the payment period lasts, the better off I am, because with inflation means that the value of the currency is depreciating. And if it's depreciating, that means the money I'm paying you is worth less than the money you originally loaned me. And so what that means is, traditionally, debtors, the poor, have always looked favorably upon inflation. Whereas creditors, it's just the opposite. Darlene told us yesterday about the preacher that she's been researching, and he wanted his 64 pounds paid in money at the value it was when he was first hired, not the value that it was 5 or 6 years later. Because he realized that the value of money depreciates as time goes on. So the poor obviously want more money. The more money there is in circulation, the more available it is, the more access they have to it. And the more money there is in circulation, the less it's worth. So that tends to separate creditor interests and debtor interests, those who loan from those who borrow. And it's very important to be aware of that. And so consequently, the fact that most of us are woefully ignorant about any of this stuff means that none of what we're looking at historically makes any sense. We can't understand why people did this and did that and did the other thing. And consequently, it becomes a little bit difficult to understand history because we really don't understand how things work. And so that consequently means that we've become vulnerable to people telling us what history means rather than figuring it out for ourselves. And so consequently, our education system functions mostly out of textbooks rather than out of primary documents and speeches and letters and the kind of primary source materials that historians write books from. The fact of the matter is, most of us are getting our history from textbooks. And of course, what a textbook is what somebody tells us something means. And so the particular political philosophy of the person writing the textbook is the stuff that many of us in our school years were required to memorize and spit back on tests. So the fact of the matter is, our understanding of the past, for the most part, is abominable. And it stands to reason why. And the fact of the matter is, what we're talking about here is history as interpreted by somebody else. In other words, we're being told what somebody wants us to believe the meaning of a particular issue is, instead of going in there and looking at what happened for ourselves and figuring out ourselves what the particular meaning of a particular issue or situation is. And the fact of the matter is that process of collecting the data and making sense of it ourselves is the skill that so much of today's world requires. The ability to make decisions, the ability to do critical thinking, the ability to think abstractly, the ability to separate, the ability to evaluate the most important or the least important in from a number of choices. And so the kinds of skills that people need to have in order to function intelligently in today's world of work are skills that many of our people don't have. Consequently, employers are going overseas in order to get people from other parts of the world who have these skills, because our young people don't. And the question is, how do we get them? And of course, one of the things that has to happen is we got to make sure that our teachers get them. And so there's a real agenda here, a real story here that all of us need to take seriously. I find, I'm repeating myself here a little bit, but the story I was telling earlier about the 1816 law placing a high tariff, a high tax on foreign books in order to keep these alien foreign ideas, dangerous ideas, out of the hands of our young people in order to protect them. And of course, what that tells us is a number of things. First of all, it tells us that those in power don't trust the ability of young people to think for themselves, or are afraid to give them the ability to think for themselves. And so their solution is to give them education that has been filtered. Make sure that what they get is something that's safe, so that what they end up believing is what we want them to believe. And in the process, they remain ignorant because they don't understand how things work. And that's what we're finding in today's financial world. It is amazing the number of people who are earning good livings, a good living, as financial advisors. And one of the things that always mystified me was many of the people who have graduated from college in programs which make them eligible to become financial advisors come from backgrounds where they never had the opportunity to learn any of this themselves because they didn't come from that kind of money. So basically what we're doing is we're training people to become professionals in telling me what I should do with my money in terms of investing. And there's a whole industry there. And the only reason that it can continue to flourish is if people remain ignorant about how to do their own investing. And so the result is that the investment game becomes extremely complicated and extremely complex. And when you stir up that pot and then you add unscrupulous advisors on top of it and vulnerable consumers, you create what Elizabeth Warren sees as a retirement crisis in America. She spends the rest of her speech from November 18th talking about the importance and the value of Social Security. And she talks about strategies. She concludes her speech by talking about strategies to actually increase and enhance and strengthen the Social Security program. The problem is, and when I say problem, I use that in quotation marks, the problem with this is, for a lot of people, is that it's making people directly dependent on government for their retirement income. And the Mitt Romneys of the world are very uncomfortable about that because their argument is that's socialism. What we want is we want people to be in control of their own retirement years, which means we want them to have their own investments, have their own retirement portfolio in order to get government out of the picture. So that becomes the basis of our political debates today. She says at the end of her speech, we should be talking about expanding Social Security benefits, not cutting them. And she points out as well that this whole thing relates to the issue of values. And what that means is, and I think this is incredibly important, and it's a way, I think it's a good way to bring our conversation today to an end. When you get into the issue of values, the question becomes, is the purpose all of this the best interests of people? Or is the objective here system? One of the things that I've learned over the years in looking at history, and I find this, I think I've mentioned this in previous programs, but it seems to me we're at an appropriate place for repeating it right here. One of the people that I admire, one of the historical figures that I admire an awful lot is Herbert Hoover. And that surprises a lot of people. Herbert Hoover knew how the system worked. He knew how finances worked. He knew how free enterprise capitalism worked. He knew about investments. He knew about prices. He knew about fluctuating values of money. He knew about all of these things. And so the irony was he was the right guy for the depression in for the market crash in 1929. He was the guy, the right person to have there, because he knew how things worked. The problem was that the depth of the fall, of the market crash, was so much deeper than anything he ever dealt with. And if you look carefully at Hoover's administration, he operated with blinders on. He did more to help people than any president before his time. But he believed in the system. And he believed government's job was not to help people, but to help the system. He had a tremendous faith in free enterprise. And basically what that faith meant to him was, if the system is strong and if the system is working, people will be able to take care of themselves. But if you do an end run around the system, and government goes into the business of taking care of people directly, then people will become directly dependent on government, and the system as we know it will collapse. So consequently, Hoover was always driven by one assumption. He would support any kind of legislation to alleviate some of the problems of the Depression, which strengthened the system, but he was adamantly opposed to any kind of government program that would directly aid people. And I think that question is pretty appropriate right here at the end of our program today. Is this all about the quality of life of people, or is it about the system which theoretically allows more people to make it than any other system in the world's history? Yet the fact remains it is a system which allows certain people to prosper. And so the question is our objective, should our focus be on the system, or should it be on the best interests of people? In your reading and in your listening to the news and things, focus on the particular positions and reactions to the speeches to the comments being delivered by the Pope. It's so interesting, because the Pope's position is the Catholic Church lost its way. It became more interested in itself as an institution than in the souls it was created to save. And what he's pointing out is we've got to get back as a world, not just a nation, as a world. We've got to get back to the idea of putting people's welfare first. And that caused him to say some pretty provocative things about the economy and about capitalism and all the rest of it. And how people react to that tells you an awful lot about what they think today's world and solutions to its problems ought to be about. It's fascinating. Tomorrow, I'd like to continue this discussion a little bit about retirement. I'd like to share with you some of the things that Bernie Sanders has said about his agenda. And I'd like to share a few personal things about retirement that I've learned. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be safe. Today, I particularly mean that because it's so cold. Check on each other. Make sure everybody around you is safe and secure. Have a wonderful evening. And please come back and join us again. For the Virtual Center, I'm Bill O'Brien. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Darlene, for that wonderful call. And good evening.